The bars were sawed, the guards were unarmed, and 26 men walked out of one of the most notorious jails in the American Southwest before sunrise without firing a single shot. It happened in Yuma, Arizona territory in the autumn of 1887, inside the granite and adobe fortress that frontier newspapers had already begun calling the hellhole on the Colorado. How does a prison built specifically to be inescapable, perched on a bluff above two rivers in the middle of a desert, lose nearly a third of its population in one coordinated breakout? And why is the man who led that breakout almost forgotten today? To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Yuma Territorial Prison was supposed to be. When it opened on July 1st, 1876, Arizona was barely 14 years old as a territory, still bleeding from Apache raids, range wars, and the lawless spillover of the Civil War's losers and drifters. The territorial legislature, meeting in Tucson, had grown desperate. County jails were wooden boxes that any determined man could kick apart. Prisoners were being lynched out of frustration or escaping out of sheer ease, and the federal government in Washington was losing patience with a territory that could not hold its own outlaws. So lawmakers chose a site on a sandstone bluff above the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers, a place where summer temperatures climbed past 115 degrees, and where the only roads in were watched for miles. The first 7 inmates actually built their own cells, hammering iron straps and hauling caliche stone under the supervision of guards who did not yet have a wall to stand on. By 1887, that improvised compound had grown into a fortress holding more than 90 men and a handful of women, surrounded by an adobe wall 18 feet high with a Gatling gun mounted in a guard tower called the Crow's Nest. If you've ever wondered what really kept the frontier together or what tore it apart, consider following along with this channel. Because we dig into the documented stories the dime novels softened and the school books skipped, the ones where the line between lawman and outlaw was thinner than a saddle blanket. Now back to Yuma, because the man at the center of our story had just arrived, and the prison did not yet know what it had brought through its iron gates. His name, according to the prison's intake ledger, was Puebla, sometimes recorded as Fernandez, sometimes as Lopez, depending on which clerk was writing and which alias he was using that month. Records from the Yuma intake books, preserved today by the Arizona State Parks Archive, are inconsistent on his birthplace, but most historians place him as a Mexican national from Sonora, convicted in Pima County for assault and grand larceny stemming from a stagecoach robbery near Tucson. He was by every account soft-spoken, literate, and dangerously patient. The guards who later wrote about him remembered a man who never raised his voice, never refused an order, and never stopped watching. He had been transferred to Yuma in the spring of 1887, and within weeks he had begun studying the routines of the night shift, the placement of the Gatling gun, and the precise hour when the desert wind off the Colorado masked the sound of metal on metal. He was not alone. The prison in 1887 held a remarkable concentration of men with grievances and skills. Among them were veterans of the Mexican borderlands wars, former Confederate guerrillas who had drifted west after Appomattox, Apache and Yaqui prisoners, who knew the river country better than any guard, and a handful of Anglo train robbers who had access to outside money. The conditions that bound them together were brutal. Inmates slept 6 to a cell in iron cages, measuring 9 feet by 8, the cages stacked inside larger granite chambers. Ventilation came from a single barred window. Discipline was enforced with a device called the snake den, a lightless cell carved into the bluff, where men were chained to a ring bolt for offenses as minor as talking after lights out. Sources differ on exactly how often the snake den was used in 1887, but Superintendent Thomas Gates, who had taken over the previous year, was known as a strict administrator who believed that fear was the only currency a frontier prison could spend. Gates is the second figure you need to understand, because the escape that was coming would nearly cost him his life and would permanently change how the territory thought about its prison. He was a former Union officer, a man who had survived the siege of Vicksburg and who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had already faced worse than anything Arizona could throw at him. He lived inside the prison walls with his family, in quarters built into the administration building. His wife and young daughters could often be heard from the cell blocks, a detail that the prisoners noted, and that would, in a strange way, save his life on the night of October 27. The plan, As later reconstructed from interrogation transcripts and from the testimony of the inmates who survived, had been months in development. Puebla had identified a weakness that no one in the administration believed existed. The main gate of the prison opened onto a small courtyard, and from that courtyard a narrow passage led past the superintendent's office. At certain hours of the day, particularly when prisoners were moved between the dining hall and the workyard, the guards in the crow's nest could not see directly into that passage. The Gatling gun, for all its menace, had blind spots, and Puebla had mapped them. He had also noticed something else. Superintendent Gates, when he heard a disturbance, would come out of his office personally rather than send a subordinate. He was that kind of officer, and a man who comes to the disturbance, Puebla reasoned, is a man who can be taken hostage. The trigger for the breakout was set for midday, not midnight, which is one of the reasons the event still stuns historians who study it. Most jail escapes in the 19th century happened under cover of darkness. Puebla chose the bright glare of a Yuma autumn afternoon, when the guards were drowsy from the heat, when the shift change was incomplete, and when Gates himself was likely to be in his office, signing the day's correspondence. Around 1 o'clock on October 27, 1887, as the prisoners were being marched back from the noon meal, a small commotion broke out near the gate. A prisoner named Ricardo Vasquez, working in coordination with Puebla, staggered as if struck with heat stroke. A guard named B.F. Hartley bent down to help him. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Vasquez seized Hartley's pistol. Puebla and 3 other men rushed the gate. Within moments, Superintendent Gates emerged from his office exactly as predicted, and Puebla was on him before he could draw his weapon. A knife pressed against the older man's throat. The prisoners now had what they needed: the body of the superintendent as a living shield, and they began moving toward the main gate, shouting in Spanish and English for the other inmates to follow. But here is where the story turns, and where the legend that grew up around the Yuma escape begins to diverge from what actually happened. Because the guard in the crow's nest, a man named Frank Hartley, no relation to the gate guard, did something that no prisoner had anticipated. He fired the Gatling gun. He did not fire it at the prisoners. He fired it directly over the courtyard into the adobe wall above the gate, sending a hail of .45-70 rounds smashing into the stone in a deafening, dust-choked roar. The sound, witnesses later said, could be heard 4 miles away in the town of Yuma. It was not aimed to kill, it was aimed to paralyze, and in that frozen instant, while every prisoner in the courtyard ducked and Puebla's grip on Gates loosened just enough, the superintendent did something extraordinary. He bit down on Puebla's hand. The detail is recorded in the official report filed by Gates himself 3 days later, a document still held in the Arizona State Library. Puebla, startled, jerked back. Gates spun free, took a knife wound across the neck that would scar him for life, and shouted to his guards to fire. What followed was not a clean victory for the prison. It was a chaotic, bloody scramble in which inmates from inside the cell blocks, hearing the Gatling gun and assuming the breakout was succeeding, surged into the corridors and overwhelmed 2 interior guards. For perhaps 15 minutes, the prison was effectively in the hands of its prisoners. 26 men reached the outer gate. Some scattered into the desert. Others made for the riverbank, where they hoped to find boats. A few inexplicably stopped to loot the kitchen. Now zoom out for a moment, because this is the kind of detail that makes the Yuma escape so revealing about the frontier as a whole. According to a survey conducted by the Territorial Governor's Office in 1889, more than 40% of all serious crimes in Arizona Territory between 1880 and 1890 involved either railroad property, livestock, or stagecoaches, and the prisoners who attempted the Yuma break that day represented almost every category of frontier crime, from cattle rustlers to train robbers to political prisoners, arrested in the borderland tensions with Mexico. The escape was not just a jailbreak. It was a cross-section of the entire violent economy of the Southwest, trying to walk out the front door at once. The recapture began almost immediately. Yuma was a town of perhaps 1,500 people, but it was wired into the wider frontier in ways that the prisoners had underestimated. Within an hour of the breakout, the alarm bell on the prison tower had been rung continuously, and by mid-afternoon, posses were forming in town on the California side of the river, and along the Southern Pacific rail line that ran east toward Maricopa. Telegraph operators flashed warnings to every station for 200 miles. The desert itself became the prison's most reliable ally. Without water, without horses, without supplies, men in striped uniforms could not travel far. By nightfall on the 27th, 8 escapees had been recaptured within 5 miles of the walls. By the morning of the 29th, that number had risen to 17. Pueblo was not among them. He had vanished into the cane brakes along the Colorado River, a tangle of dense reeds and cottonwoods that ran for miles south toward the Mexican border. Tracking him through that terrain was nearly impossible. The river itself, sluggish and brown in late October, offered cover and a path of escape. Some accounts drawn from later interviews with Cocopah and Quechan tribal members who lived along the river suggest that Pueblo received help from sympathetic Mexican farmers on the lower Colorado, who had no love for the territorial government. Other accounts, including a report filed by a deputy U.S. Marshal in early November, claimed that he was sighted near the border town of San Luis, traveling alone and on foot. The records, as they so often are with frontier fugitives, are incomplete and contradictory. What is documented is that Superintendent Gates survived. The wound across his throat healed, though he wore a high collar for the rest of his career to hide the scar. He kept his job, and in the months following the escape, he instituted a series of reforms that would reshape the prison. The Gatling gun in the crow's nest was supplemented with 2 additional rifles. The interior corridors were restructured so that no single hostage could open the entire facility. The snake den, which had been used to punish 12 men in the year before the escape, was used to punish 31 in the year after. Pueblo's revolt, in other words, made Yuma harsher, not gentler. And here lies one of the cruel ironies of frontier law and order. The men who were recaptured faced consequences that varied wildly depending on who they were. Anglo prisoners in several documented cases received reduced punishments because they had testified against the ringleaders. Mexican and native prisoners, particularly the Yaqui men involved, were placed in the snake den for weeks at a time. One inmate, a Yaqui named Geronimo Miranda, no relation to the famous Apache leader, died in the snake den in February of 1888, from what the prison physician recorded as exhaustion and heat exposure, despite the fact that February in Yuma is one of the cooler months. The territorial press barely noted his death. The escape in the public memory was already being rewritten as a story of heroic guards defending civilization against savage criminals, with the racial dimensions of who was punished and how quietly erased. Meanwhile, the question of Puebla himself became one of the great unsolved puzzles of southwestern law enforcement. Wanted posters were circulated as far as El Paso and Hermosillo. The reward, initially set at $200, was raised to $500 by the spring of 1888, a substantial sum at a time when a cowboy earned roughly $30 a month. Pinkerton agents working under contract for the Southern Pacific Railroad took an interest in the case because Pueblo was suspected of involvement in train robberies that predated his Yuma sentence. And yet, despite this attention, no confirmed sighting of him was ever made after early 1888. He had walked out of the most secure prison in the Arizona Territory, crossed one of the deadliest deserts in North America, and disappeared into the borderlands as completely as if he had never existed. There are theories, as there always are. One holds that he died in the desert within days of the escape, his body never found, picked apart by coyotes in some arroyo south of the Gila. Another, more popular among Sonoran folklorists, claims that he reached his home village in Mexico, took up a quiet life as a farmer, and lived into the early 20th century under his real name, which some sources give as Librado Puebla. A third theory, advanced by a historian named Clifton Adams in the 1930s, based on interviews with elderly residents of the lower Colorado, suggests that Puebla joined one of the bands of revolutionaries that were already beginning to organize against the Diaz regime in northern Mexico, and that he died in one of the early skirmishes that would eventually spiral into the Mexican Revolution of 1910. None of these theories has ever been proven. The records, where they exist, are too thin. What is certain is the long-term consequence of the escape, both for the prison and for the territory. Yuma Territorial Prison would continue to operate until 1909, when it was finally closed and its inmates transferred to a new facility at Florence. In its 33 years of operation, it housed more than 3,000 men and 29 women. The 1887 escape was the largest single mass breakout in its history, and it was the only one that ever came close to succeeding. After Puebla, no prisoner ever again seriously threatened to take over the facility, and Superintendent Gates served until his retirement in 1893 with a reputation as the man who had stared down a knife and bitten his way to freedom. But the deeper consequence was felt in how the Arizona Territory and the broader American Southwest thought about itself. The escape forced territorial leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their justice system was not yet a system at all. It was a patchwork of overworked sheriffs, undermanned prisons, and racial assumptions that left enormous gaps for determined men to slip through. In the years following the escape, the territorial legislature appropriated funds for new county jails, increased the salaries of guards, and began the slow process of professionalizing law enforcement that would, by statehood in 1912, give Arizona a recognizably modern criminal justice infrastructure. The Yuma escape, in other words, was a hinge moment. It marked the end of the era when one charismatic prisoner with a knife and a plan could threaten the entire apparatus of frontier law. It also marked something else, something quieter and harder to measure. The borderlands of the late 1880s were a place where identity was fluid, where men crossed the Colorado and the Rio Grande as easily as they changed names, where a Mexican national convicted in Tucson could vanish into Sonora and become, depending on the storyteller, a corpse, a farmer, or a revolutionary. The frontier was not only a place, it was a permission, an opportunity to disappear, to remake oneself, to escape not just from a prison, but from an entire life. Puebla's vanishing was extreme, but it was not unique. Thousands of men and women in the late 19th century used the porous geography of the Southwest to step out of one identity and into another. Some were criminals. Many were simply poor or fugitive from debts or fleeing wars and famines on either side of the border. The infrastructure that the United States and Mexico would eventually build to monitor and control that movement, the Border Patrol, the immigration stations, the wire fences, the surveillance towers, all of it grew in part out of incidents like the Yuma escape, out of the realization that a man who could disappear was a man the state could not govern. There is a final detail worth lingering on in 1939, more than half a century after the breakout. A researcher from the Works Progress Administration interviewing elderly residents of the lower Colorado region recorded a story from a woman in her 80s who had grown up on a small farm near the river. She remembered, she said, a quiet man who had stayed at her family's home for 2 nights when she was a child. He had a long scar across his palm, as if from a deep bite. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and watched the road constantly. Her parents had not used his name, and he had moved on before dawn on the 3rd morning, walking south. The interviewer noted the story but added no commentary. It may have been Puebla. It may have been 100 other men. The frontier, in the end, kept its secrets the way it kept everything else, with a vast and indifferent silence. What the Yuma escape leaves us with more than a century later is not just a thrilling story of bars and Gatling guns and a knife at a superintendent's throat. It is a window into how fragile order really was on the American frontier, how much of what we now call law and civilization rested on improvisation, on luck, on the courage of a single guard in a tower making a split-second decision to fire over a courtyard rather than into it. It is a reminder that the men we remember as outlaws were often the most organized people in a disorganized landscape, and that the institutions we now take for granted were built, brick by brick and reform by reform, in response to nights like October 27, 1887. Every prison, every patrol, every system of identification we now consider routine has, somewhere in its lineage, a Puebla, a man who proved that the old way was not enough. The frontier did not end because the wilderness was tamed. It ended because the cracks in the walls, the ones that men like Puebla walked through, were finally, slowly, and at enormous human cost, sealed shut. And somewhere in the silence of the Sonoran Desert, the question of what happened to him remains exactly where he left it, waiting for an answer that the records will probably never give.